massive displacement.
Sorry,
There are
Kerri.
more people displaced in our world today than in any time in recorded history. And it's only growing each and every year. And that's because we're seeing many more conflict situations, but disaster situations as well. The severity of these situations and the scale are getting worse and worse as the climate is changing. Everything from cyclone situations, monsoon situation, volcano situation, to the recent earthquakes that we've seen in southern Turkey and northern Syria, to even just prolonged conflict situations that are lasting a decade or longer. We've seen this in Syria over the past 11 years, where we've been responding to the civil war there. And so really, one of the things that troubles me the most is really the fact that of all the people displaced in our world today, 75% of them are women and children. And women and children suffer disproportionately in these disaster and crisis situations. So what do we do as a humanitarian organization at ShelterBox? Well, we focus on one of the basic needs that we all have as humans, and that is the need for shelter. Our needs focus around food, water, shelter, access to medical care. ShelterBox is really focused on the provision of emergency shelter and the essential things that you need to set up a household if you lose everything in an instant and you're forced to flee your home. And I can tell you, I've just returned last week from working in Ukraine, how many families have minutes to flee their home with little more than the clothes on their back and have been displaced from their homes now for over a year. So what are the things that we provide? Well, the center of gravity for what we do at ShelterBox is a shelter, and that can take many different shapes and sizes. Sometimes it is a humanitarian relief tent. I know this looks like a recreation tent. This is not. This is a humanitarian tent made for a family to live in for a period of weeks to months following a disaster. We have a variety of different types of shelter solutions that we provide around the world, depending on the type of conflict or crisis we're responding to, the weather we're responding to. So that will change, but really it's to provide a place and a roof over a home for a family so they can begin the long road to recovery. But the other things that we provide that are so essential for life are things like water purification. So often in disasters, you've had contamination of water source. We provide solar lanterns and lamps because you've lost power in so many instances. We also provide vital items like high thermal blankets, also tools to help with the recovery process, things like mosquito nets, but then also things to help prepare a hot meal, boil water, restore routine for a family, a whole stainless steel cook set. So the types of aid materials we are deploying really depend on the situation that we're going into. And I can tell you it's always different. We also provide a variety of different other shelter solutions to help people quickly repair a home that's been damaged so they can shelter in place. We're providing thousands of these in Ukraine for people whose homes have been bombed so they can patch up roofs, walls, seal up windows. But these kits also can create a single room structure for a family who has been displaced. So a variety of different items, and we customize them to meet the unique needs of the families in the moment where they're at. ShelterBox has been around for 23 years. We've supported over 3 million people in over 100 countries, 300 disaster and crisis situations. That includes even places like the United States. But we tend to really focus our efforts, the majority of our efforts, on the most vulnerable people on the planet. And so if you look on the Human Development Index, it's the poorest places on the planet. We have an army of volunteers. We were built on the backbones of volunteers. Many, as you can see, are women. These are some of the most highly trained people in emergency response. They comprise what's known as the ShelterBox response team. They go through about a year of training before they make it through the program. 1 in 30 people will make it through and become a first responder with our organization, but they deploy to the front lines of the world's worst crisis disaster situations and really enable our response. We've had some very large scale responses over the years, things you've heard about, things like the Haiti earthquake in 2010. This was the Indian Ocean tsunami, but also long protracted conflicts like you've seen in places like Syria. This is an example of that, a Syrian refugee who fled to Lebanon, and the first home that that baby had was a shelter box tent. And so again, really working to find the most vulnerable people in our world today. Several years ago, we created what's known as the She Campaign. And it was really to start to build awareness of how women are suffering disproportionately in these disaster and crisis situations. And it's unbelievable to tell you the numbers because they're still shocking even to me. I mentioned 75%. That number is that the fact that women and children account for more than 75% of refugees and displaced persons globally. I hear it's even closer to 80%. Women are much more likely to die during a natural disaster than men, in upwards of even 14 times as likely. What we saw in the Indian Ocean tsunami was that 4 times as many women were killed than men in that massive disaster for many reasons. Women tend to be the primary caregivers of not just children, but extended family as well. So many women were home that day caring for many people in their family. Also, men were off to work and men were taught to swim. Men are taught to climb trees where women are not. And so women find themselves in a particularly vulnerable situation for many reasons when these massive disasters happen. We know that 60% of preventable maternal mortality takes place in settings of conflict, which is unfortunate, and that all forms of violence, and especially sexual violence, increase when women are in disaster and displacement settings. We also know that adolescent girls are much more likely to be out of school when they're in a conflict setting, and upwards of 90% more likely to be out of school versus girls that are in conflict-free environments. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities, which is why at Shelterbox, we work to empower really the most vulnerable, and they're often women, they're often children, they're often elderly and disabled, and we're working to make an impact around the world to help lift women up with the tools and resources they need to empower their recovery. But the first step is involving women in our disaster relief efforts. And the reason is that while women may suffer disproportionately in disasters, they're absolutely pivotal. They are critical to community recovery. And so we want to involve them early in the process and help them with the things that they need. So that could be everything from the tools. So putting the aid could be putting aid, it could be putting multi-purpose cash allotment, working alongside women in the recovery process. This is an example of a distribution, but a woman receiving a shelter kit. We also involve them in the training process. So to helping them how to build back better, how to reinforce their homes, how to utilize the aid materials, how to train other women on how to do the same. It's a big part of what we do in our work. We also often hire female aid workers in the field from the communities that we're serving, so they can help with beneficiary selection. They can help with distribution, training, as well as monitoring and evaluation and learning. So embedding women in the heart of what we do in our work. I want to share with you some recent work because I think it really helps speak to who we look to find and who we look to lift up in our work at Shelterbox. For several years, we've been working in one of the most vulnerable areas of our world, and it's in the Lake Chad Basin of Africa, and it's in a country called Cameroon. This is an area that's referred to as the forgotten crisis. And what you see are tens of thousands of refugees, mostly women and kids, coming from Nigeria, fleeing conflict situations, fleeing even drought situations across the Lake Chad Basin, and fleeing Boko Haram violence. And many of them have had the horrors of living through horrible violence just to make it to this refugee camp, which is in Cameroon. It's called the Minnewaw Refugee Camp. This was initially designed in around 2013-14. It was designed for about 15,000 people. There are now over 75,000 people who've made the camp their home. And many of these women, when they come into the camp, are living in transit centers and collective centers, overcrowded centers, as they're processed into the camp. And really, their life changes when they receive a shelter box tent, a shelter box kit, as well as a plot of land from the government to begin their recovery process. And our role in this camp is that we are the only providers of tents to new arrivals at the camp. But we are also helping long-term people who are displaced, because as many of you know, if you are a refugee, on average, you're often displaced in upwards of 17 years from your home. And so this is an example, and this is actually this week of some of the distributions that we were doing in Cameroon, as you can see, with shelter kit solutions. But we're providing a variety of tools, and in addition to things like tarps and tools, we're helping them with things like basic timber, also corrugated iron, mud brick, to create more semi-durable homes for these families. This is an example of one of those more semi-durable, moving towards a more permanent structure for some of these families who will be displaced for a very long period of time. So I'd like to share with you one of the families that is near and dear to my heart. Her name is Esther. And in 2014, Esther was living in Boko, Nigeria as a young teenage girl. She was in the middle of the night when the Boko Haram militant group stormed her village. They raped and murdered her mother and killed her father and brothers. And they told Esther to run. And she was likely meant to be target practice for this militant group. But Esther miraculously made it to the Cameroonian border with a bunch of Cameroonian schoolgirls. And she was taken to this camp that I mentioned, the Minnewaw camp, where she's lived ever since. Esther had a very difficult time, as you can imagine, assimilating into the camp. She experienced horrible trauma. But one of the things that changed Esther's life was receiving a sewing class. And this was not provided by Shelterbox. It was part of the infrastructure of the camp, which the UN is engaged and involved in. And she received some classes, and she has now become one of the finest seamstresses in her block of the camp. And she's married now. She has 2 children, and she's the primary breadwinner for her family. She's what's known as long-term displaced. And this is what she shared. She shared, anytime I see somebody wearing something that I've sewed, it makes me happy. I can now take care of some family needs like cooking and other things. So Esther is indicative of who we work to find, providing things like cooking sets, things like tarpaulins to help repair her home, basic things like blankets, solar lights, things to help enable her on the long road to recovery that she's had over many, many years there. And this is an important part of our work. It's quiet work. It doesn't make the headlines, but it is some of the most life-saving work that we do in helping to lift up women in all of our work at Shelterbox. I'm going to shift gears now to just a couple pieces of work that many of you are hearing about in the news. Many of you might be wondering, what are we doing? We immediately deployed a team. We've had many people working in southern Turkey since the onset of a series of earthquakes in southern Turkey and northern Syria. We've seen over 50,000 people who've been killed, millions of people displaced, and many cities have been really amounted to rubble. And so for our organization, it meant quickly arriving on the ground, coordinating with our local partners. That means groups like Rotary International, where we remain the global partner of Rotary in disaster relief. We also have long-term suppliers in southern Turkey that we work to make things like blankets and children's coats and clothing and winter gear, because we work so often in places like Syria. And so we immediately mobilized some of our aid. That includes tents that we provided. We were able to get a donated Turkish Airlines airlift, pre-positioned tents that we immediately deployed to Turkey, which are being distributed so families have a place to call home in the immediate aftermath of this disaster. But we're also working in Syria, and this is an example of a building in Syria. We've already begun deploying aid there, and it's basic things like blankets. It's a lot of children's clothing at this point because we had it pre-positioned in the country for the winter months. It's high thermal blankets. We'll be doing high thermal sleeping bags, solar lanterns, and obviously a lot of shelter between the two countries. We're well positioned to be able to help. And as I mentioned, that's because we've been working in Syria for so long. This is part of our long-term work. This is the reason why in 2018 and in 2019, Shelterbox was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and it was for our work in Syria, quiet work in Syria that's now been going on for over 11 years. Also, just shifting gears to Ukraine. I just came back from Ukraine, where I was working in Kyiv on our humanitarian distributions. Unprecedented displacement we've seen over the past year. 13 million people have been displaced between internal displacement within the country and then refugees who fled Ukraine. I was working there a year ago when really the whole displacement crisis was starting. What I envisioned back then was, and visualized very directly, was tens of thousands of people coming to the border every day. And they were coming to the border of Poland, mostly women, mostly children, elderly, disabled, people fleeing with little more than the clothes on their back, maybe bringing a pet, and really having no idea where they were going to sleep. And millions of people were displaced across Europe and staying with host families, staying in collective centers. But really, what I saw was an incredible disproportionate burden of care, particularly on extended family and children, on the women. And men, they also have a difficult role. Many of them were conscripted into the military if they were between 18 and 60. So a really difficult situation as families were literally ripped apart, and many of them remain displaced today. We've had a series of programs there over the past year to help both refugees as well as internally displaced people, providing basic essentials, things like mattresses that you see here, so people have a place to sleep in collective centers, in shelters. Also, basic things to help repair homes that have been damaged. These are our shelter kits that we've been providing because many people have returned home. Many people never left their homes. And what they're needing to do now is seal up and help improve homes that have been damaged. So we're providing our things like our tarps, plastic sheeting and foam sealants to seal up those windows, which is essential. Obviously provide a roof on a home when they've been damaged. These are temporary repairs so people can temporarily shelter in place, which is essential. The challenge we found a year later is that what we're seeing is that there's been so many airstrikes on critical infrastructure like power that many people are living in homes without power, without heat, without running water, and it's the middle of winter and it's freezing. So over the past year, we've really had to adapt our aid package to meet people in the moment they're in, and that's winter right now. So on my distributions we were doing over the past few weeks, we really focused on people who were displaced, living in collective centers or overcrowded apartments where they needed just to survive this moment. So we were providing basic things. And this is an example of an apartment block that had been bombed. Amazingly, What you see to the right in this picture is people are still living in these buildings that are damaged. So what are the things that they need? They need solar lights because there's no power. They need plastic sheeting to seal up those windows. They need stoves. So we've been providing basic things like stoves. They need high thermal sleeping bags because sometimes it's as cold inside as it is outside. They need high thermal blankets. They need coats and clothing. They also need water containers to store clean water. So they have that. So it's a very unique array of items that really help them in this moment. And we've served 50,000 people up until this project that we started 2 weeks ago. We're going to serve another 30,000 people this winter, just in Ukraine alone. And we know our work is not done yet. We have a lot more work to do. And I would say, one thing that was really empowering to me when I was there last week is I worked with so many of our distribution partners on the ground. They're Ukrainian. They become humanitarian aid workers. And most of the people I was working with were women that were going into the arteries of their community to find the most vulnerable people who were displaced, to really help them survive in the aftermath of this war, which continues. As you know, we're moving into what's called the spring offensive. I was in the country a matter of minutes before the air raid siren alerts were going off. It's absolutely horrible that you're living in a state of fear and terror every day because the air raid alerts go off and you're in the bomb shelter, which could be hours a day, particularly for young children who are students. It's a really, really difficult way of life. I will say Ukrainians are incredibly resilient, but with that, they're tired and they want this war to be over. But we don't see at this point an end in sight. And so we've remained absolutely committed to helping people survive and just meet them with the material aid that they need in the moment. And it keeps shifting and it will continue to shift and change as we move forward. So a few things about the organization. We are an official project partner of Rotary in disaster situations. They do really help us with serving as volunteers on the ground. We've received a lot of recognition from groups like GuideStar as well as Charity Navigator. And our organization is privately charitable funded. We don't receive government funding. It's literally a global effort of individuals, and it's churches, schools, foundations, businesses who get behind the global work. So I'm thrilled to be able to share with you a bit about the work today. I'm also going to include my email address in case you want to reach out to me about volunteer opportunities, if you want to support the organization in some way. But Sharon, would I be able to take any questions people have today?
Yeah,
Okay.
I was gonna suggest that since you've got to go in about 12 minutes, that what we do is if you have any specific questions for Shelterbox and Kerri and the work that they do, please ask them now. You can either raise your hand using the raise hand function in the reactions, or put a question in chat, and we're happy to do it. Kerri, you did get a nod in the chat of somebody, Mercy, saying you're doing such incredible work. But yes, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Kerri's happy to answer them in the limited time she's got left with us. Okay, now y'all don't be afraid to ask questions here. There's no stupid questions. They're all good.
And I'm so thrilled to be here, Sharon. So thank you for inviting me. It's the perfect audience that I would want to be with today. So thank you. It makes me really happy that you've all turned up to learn.
Catherine, go ahead.
I have to say, and I'm embarrassed to say this, that I have not heard of Shelterbox. I am just floored with what you do and the areas you go into, where you really are risking your life and your volunteers too. It almost makes me want to cry. It's just so beautiful. I'm always amazed at logistics of such a project. I'm impressed that the other thing that you do have partners. How do you partner on the ground, like for example, in Ukraine? I noticed there was something in Ukraine on one of the pictures you had. How do you do that?
Well, initially, I was part of the team that first deployed to Poland to the border a year ago. You know, I would say in a disaster or even this conflict setting, there's always this urgency to act. There's not great information to act on. So information is the premium. We typically deploy boots on the ground to these situations to begin coordinating within what's usually called the UN cluster system. So we coordinate with other NGOs and we coordinate with what's known as the shelter and camp management cluster. So what they do is they kind of peel off layers based on the different things people need in these situations. So it could be sanitation, it could be food, it could be water. And we feed into obviously housing and the things that people need around setting up households. So we do coordinate within a framework that exists today. Typically, it doesn't always happen. But what we also do is we have long-term partnerships around the world of groups that we work with. So groups that you probably heard of, Habitat for Humanity, I mentioned Rotary, we often work with Red Cross, groups like Care International. So the first thing we do is we look to understand and assess the situation. We never just send things in. We really work to understand what are the unique needs, how many people, what are their displacement needs? Are there other groups already doing that? We want to avoid duplication. Do we have the appropriate aid in the situation? Is government requested international aid to come in, right? So we want to make sure that we're coordinating, not just, with other partners, but with the government to understand, can we do this effectively? Can we ensure that we can get the aid to the people that need it most? And sometimes that's very difficult. And so we begin really collecting and gathering this information, but also assessing, okay, what aid do we have on hand? So when we were a year ago on the Ukraine border, we were looking at what do we have in inventory that can meet the needs right now of refugees as well as internally displaced people. We found, okay, it's middle of winter, we have blankets, we have mattresses, we have solar lanterns, and we begin the logistical challenge, and it's immense, of really working to coordinate to get the aid in. We find on the ground local partners in all of these situations that help us with distributions. They help with beneficiary selection, they help with training, they help with distributions, and they help with monitoring and evaluation of the impact of these programs. So we always really work to find great local partners. Sometimes we've had them for years or decades. Sometimes they're new ones we're building in the moment, which is the case in Ukraine. We have several new partners we've established over the past year, which are wonderful local NGOs that are already part of the fabric of their communities, that have kind of shifted their lens to do something very different than they used to do because of the needs that are there. So it's a great question. And I think the logistical piece of what we do is the one of the most complex pieces of the other. The other is often the funding piece. And the hardest decision we have to make is saying no, that we don't have enough funding to go to the next place, right? There's a big cyclone that's taking place right now in Vanuatu. It's displaced a lot of people in Vanuatu, Cyclone Judy. There's a massive displacement just now in Panama from a recent outbreak of fires. So there's so many things happening in our world. We really have to be judicious in how we are allocating our resources because they're finite. There's a finite amount. There's not, unlimited. Thank you, Catherine.
Kerri, you got a couple other questions in the comments as well, such as how do you source material? And is there a way that people can help, right, virtually?
Mm-hmm. So we source, we've had, I showed you, so the tent you see there, that actually was designed initially out of a extreme mountaineering company out of Scotland called Vengo. They began making these tents for us 23 years ago. We are on version like 13. We've consistently worked to make it better. Adding the patio on the front, adding light areas for light and ventilation, a back entry as well, privacy screens for rooms. These were really made and designed for humanitarian purposes. We have them designed, we then procure them. So we have a procurement team that works on a steady stream of precisely the right things we need. That's our solar lanterns, that's our blankets, that's our cook sets. we often and are moving towards also a localized approach of procuring things that we need locally. Right now in Turkey, we're having our manufacturer in Gaziantep make blankets for us in country. So we, or we're procuring corrugated iron in country, framing, nails. So we often will adapt the kit with what we can also source that's plentiful locally, and also helps the local economy.
And your volunteers, they're the workers that you have in the field that are actually doing the deployments, right? From Shelter Box. You mentioned before they're highly trained volunteers. That's correct?
Amazing. They're incredible. Yes. And continually train. And in order to deploy, they have to train every month, like reservists. They have to stay active by having a deployment every year. We have response team members in Turkey right now, but these are some of the most highly trained people in really emergency response. And they risk their lives to do this work. I think that's exactly right.
And you are deployed mostly internationally, right? Not stateside. Is that correct?
Mostly. Yes. Yes. How people can get involved. Shelterboxusa.org has a variety of ways, everything from helping provide a charitable donation for a tent, a shelter light, a blanket, to volunteer opportunities. So you can learn more on our website. You can also email me as well. We also have ambassador volunteers in the United States. They're not deploying to the front lines of crisis, but they're helping to spread the word and build awareness locally. And that is an amazing group. We have about 200 nationally. We're always looking to add to our ambassador group, but it also is it's a wonderful way.
Okay. And you do have the ability to donate, obviously, to the organization to support the work, right? You are a donation funded organization.
Yeah, we have an emergency appeal right now because we are doing so much around the world. We are strapped. We've drawn down on pretty much everything.
Kerri, I have to say, it is such a pleasure to have you with us. I'm so grateful that you are in our community, in our local Santa Barbara community, but our United States community and our world community, and especially in the way that you have tried to elevate and help women who face the brunt of disasters and who are disproportionately affected. It is just a delight to have you be able to talk with us. And I'm so grateful. And I know you've got a dash to your daughter, to your international flight. So I thank you also for attending to the business of being a woman. For joining us today.
And Sharon, right back at you. I mean, you truly lead by example, and I'm always inspired by the work you're doing. So thank you for bringing us together today. It made my week. Thank you.
All right, so we are going to switch gears. We've had a good visit with Kerri from Shelter Box USA. My name is Sharon Byrne, and I'm the organizer of today's event. I'm with the United Nations Association of Santa Barbara, and it's a great little group. But one of the things that sort of happened to me, and I'm going to shift gears a little bit with you now. Kerri's kind of walked you through what's on the ground equipment. How do you do organizing? How do you get volunteers in for a disaster? And as you saw, Kerri's working a lot globally. I am not, although I would love to. I'm working much more locally. And what I'm going to talk to you about is the importance of women really in disaster recovery. And believe me, it's an interesting role. I didn't expect to be in it myself. I'm a community organizer and a political consultant. So one of the things I like to do is get women elected to political office, because I believe that when there are more of us running the show, things are going to get a lot better around here. And the bar has been set awfully low. We can only do better, I think. So one of the things I do a lot of work in is community organizing. And because of that role, I sort of stumbled into disaster recovery. So I'm going to talk to you about what are the definitions of disaster. And in the poll, several of you answered that you had been exposed to disaster by conflict, by natural occurrence, like what is happening a lot in my home state of California, and that you'd also had some personal experiences. So we're going to talk about what's the definition of a disaster, the stages of a disaster, and these are mainly psychological, but pretty much they all go this way. So I want to recognize the stages. What are women's particular strengths in disaster? And we do have several. And what are the opportunities here? And we're, and then of course, Kerri has already gone with her presentation. So a little about me. I'm an avowed feminist, a writer, and a community organizer. I do most of my work in the Santa Barbara, California area. And I've had the blessed or unexpected experience of being put in the path of several natural disasters. The first one was a terrible thunderstorm in Dallas, Texas in 1994, which turned out to be the worst thunderstorm in United States history, and the most expensive. And I moved to California and immediately got acquainted with wildfire, which I was also not used to. And where I live in Santa Barbara is subject to quite a few wildfires. And we went through in 2017, the worst wildfire in California history. And it held that position for all of about 10 minutes until the next 5 wildfires broke out, and they were even bigger. We're in the era in California, we're in the era of the gigafire now, right? Where it just burns thousands and thousands and thousands of acres and displaces tons of people and causes a lot of destruction. Immediately after the Thomas fire, when we all thought, wow, we're out of the choking ash and smoke that we've lived under for the last 45 days, we unfortunately had a rainstorm, and it killed 23 people in devastating mudslides that we were not really prepared for. So I've learned a lot, I guess you could say, about how to prepare for these kinds of things. Then we went into the pandemic, and I should tell you that was a worldwide disaster. We all got to experience that one. No one was spared from that one. And in the middle of all that, my parents, who were living in Puerto Rico, experienced Hurricane Maria and went missing, and I had to go get a helicopter up to go find them, and it was quite the experience. So like I say, it's just an unwitting sort of step into disaster. Didn't intend to, didn't think this would be kind of my life, but it sort of happened this way. And I'm just rolling with it. All right, so here's the definitions of disaster. So this is from the UN office, actually, for disaster risk reduction, right? And that disaster has some serious talking points here. One is it's a serious disruption, not minor, but serious, of the functioning of a community or a society at any scale. Scale is another big part of this, due to hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, capacity, leading to one or more of the following: human, material, economic, environmental losses, and impacts. So disasters are not just a, sort of, well, we had a bad storm or whatever. It's like it caused a lot of problems, and it caused them at scale. So they have more refined talking points here, which is, there's small scale disasters, right? Which is kind of what I have been through a lot of, which is that, it only hit the community. And that is one of the things that psychologically is upsetting, but also reassuring about disaster until it hits the pandemic sort of level, which is it's intensely local. That where it hits is who's affected. If you're just far enough away from it, it doesn't affect you. And that applies to conflict situations as well. Large scale disasters, which is where we have to have national or international assistance. Frequent and infrequent, right? Depending on the probability. In California, we're discovering that what used to be infrequent fires are now getting pretty regular. So are atmospheric storms, which do tons of damage. A slow onset, right, is one that emerges gradually over time. So this is like drought, desertification, such as what we're seeing in Sudan, sea level rise, epidemic diseases. And then sudden is what we've all seen a lot of in the headlines, really in the last couple of years, including, the invasion of Ukraine, the earthquakes in Syria, and how how in Turkey, that it's very, very fast, right? That has come on. There were volcanic eruptions in, the Canary Islands, right? Last year, there have been chemical explosions. We've seen quite a lot of the sudden onset disasters. So these are the stages of disaster. And like I said, these are actually very psychological, more even than physical, but I'm going to walk you through them a little bit. So there's pre-disaster, and pre-disaster is really, really important. It's what we do to get ready for one, whether it's the earthquake drills, it's the, identify where in communities shelters would be in the event of a disaster, in the face of a coming conflict, where are people going to go, who's in charge, who gets to make certain decisions, right? What are going to be the resources, so it's the pre-planning that is like really huge, actually, because usually there's quite a bit of chaos and disaster. And so if somebody has a game plan ahead of time, it's very, very helpful. Then there's the impact itself, and the impact can be very, very fast, such as an earthquake, right? That comes on and it's over in 10 seconds, but it's done terrible damage, right? Or it can be like in the case of a wildfire, right? Really long, we lived for about 40 days under the Thomas fire, and it was pretty awful that the impact was unfolding that whole time. The next stage is heroic. So after the disaster is impacted, and everybody's kind of stunned and reeling, there's an immediate rush to save everyone, right? So let's save as many people as we can. Let's save whatever things we can. There's a lot of heroics that go on where people do just Herculean feats to try to save others. After the heroics, there's typically kind of an assessment and huddle phase. So the community that has survived usually will come together and kind of huddle and say, okay, we made it. We made it and we're okay. And how bad is it? And who have we lost? And what do we need to do? So there's this kind of assessment and gathering phase. And this is where you're going to really kind of, Natasha, could you go on mute, please? Nishika, do you mind putting yourself on mute? Thank you. The next phase and the next two phases are where it gets really kind of dangerous. So after the kind of assessment phase, people start to realize that we're not going to go back to normal, whatever that was, anytime soon. And it's going to take a lot to get out of whatever this disaster has done to us, right? Whether it's rebuilding of buildings, bridges, roads, or whether it's, rebuilding of a society that's been devastated. Once people realize that, boy, we're just not going to recover from this very quickly. This is going to be a long clawback. There's a lot of dejection and anger that comes in, and that really drops everybody into the next stage, which is very dangerous. And that's everyone for their selfism. It's usually called every man for himself, but it's really everyone for themselves. And I remember the first time seeing this live was actually in Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, way back in 2007, when it took about 2 days for everything to go pretty much lawless. That people were starting to do just terrible things, right? Because the veneer of society is very, very thin, and a disaster can really wipe out whatever structures were in place that we all behaved by. And so people can start getting fairly dangerous, right? After Hurricane Maria, I got a lot of reports from the ground there that, about 2 days in, when people realized A, help wasn't coming very quickly, and B, the power wasn't coming back on, that things were bad. You started seeing kind of men in the streets with baseball bats, and you started hearing about, stores being looted. So that phase, everyone for their selfism, is super dangerous. And then you go to the final phase, and that phase can take years, honestly, a decade or more. And that's real recovery, where we're going to navigate to whatever is going to be our new normal. And we're going to build whatever it is that needs to get rebuilt. And we're going to have a community, but it's not going to be the community that it was previous to the disaster. And it's not going to be the same as it was previous to disaster, but it's real recovery. And sometimes greater things can come out of real recovery than even existed previous to the disaster. So there's certain stages here where women have very strong talents and skills, right? And should be playing absolutely strong leadership roles. And that is in the pre-disaster phase, right? Women have got to be, I cannot tell you how much I agree with Secretary General Antonio Guterres' statement that women need to be at the decision-making table. Yes, they need to be in the pre-disaster planning and preparation phase. They need to be in part of the impact phase, right? They need to understand how to assess the impact. Heroics, well, we typically leave those to what we call the first responders, right? The firemen, the policemen, the sheriffs, the, Coast Guard guys, the armies, that's kind of who we leave the heroics to. But women also can do quite a bit of saving. In the mudslide that hit Montecito in 2018, there were women pulling other people from the mud, right, to save lives. The assessment and huddle phase, that is where women lead. Women are really good at gathering everybody together and figuring out what is what and what's standing and what's not, and who's who and who's made it. And we're really good at that kind of thing. And we're good at calming down the frustration, dejection, and anger phase, because this is where women are able to use our collaborative skills and say, look, everybody needs to pull together right now. The everyone for their selfism stage is super dangerous. And that's the one to really kind of try to avoid or try to get past as quickly as you can. Safety is really the important thing in that particular phase. And then in the real recovery phase, again, women should play a strong role of, well, you know what? Nobody liked that bridge and now that bridge is gone. So let's build a better bridge, right? Or, pre-disaster, we knew that we had a problem and that we didn't have a strong community in this way, and now we should. So in the real recovery phase, women can take a very strong leading role in defining what things are going to be like in our future, especially so that we don't go through disaster like this again, or that if it's going to happen again, like it is in California, right, with wildfires, or if you live in an earthquake prone zone, then we're better prepared for it next time. So we have some key strengths we can bring to this table. Leadership. So there's an old African proverb that's been told to me. I hope I get it right. And that is that if you want to go fast, go by yourself. If you want to go far, you have to go together. And women who go together and stand together go much further, right? And they could take their communities much further when we stand together. And that is part of our natural leadership strength. We're inclusive. We don't leave anybody behind. We are careful with others. And so that is something that is really important, because those are natural leadership skills that aren't often in evidence, especially in disaster recovery, but are key. So communications, this is how I ended up in disaster work, is that because I was a community organizer, I got pulled aside by first responders who said, we need you to come into the FEMA tent with us, right? Where we're, working with California Fire to try to figure out how we're going to evacuate people, how we're going to message people. And honestly, since you already, message a lot of people in your work, you will stop our phones from ringing. So I had to go to meetings in the morning and meetings at night to figure out how we were going to evacuate people and then rebuild the community after the mud flow. And, it was my job to then turn that around and do so in a thoughtful way that took care of people's feelings who had been displaced, who were evacuated out, who were angry and upset because their property was gone, their home was gone. They left with the clothes on their back, and they didn't even have their insurance paperwork. They didn't have anything to kind of get themselves back on their feet, right? There's an old joke. It was told by a male comedian, I want to say, a good 20 years ago. And it was that, men in terms of communications are like the rabbit ears on the TV, right? With tinfoil on them, they can kind of get one channel and, interruptedly, but women were like super information highways, right? They're like giant satellite dishes that were really, really good at communicating on multiple levels, not just in terms of verbally, but we're really good with our body language, and we're really good at inclusive communication. And we tend to serve as inclusive nerve centers, right? That, we are really good at gathering information, and they're really good at sharing it where it needs to go. We're also really good at organizing. It turned out to be a strength of mine. I've seen it in a lot of other women, whether it's at the family level or at the city level. It's honestly some of the cities that I've seen that are run by women are some of the best run cities in terms of just being organized and making sure that everyone's needs are taken care of. We also tend to have extensive knowledge of the communities, right, that we're in, who's in them, what's in them, what are the resources, and what are kind of the dangers in our communities. And that knowledge is really invaluable, especially for people that are coming in on a disaster, have no understanding of the terrain that they're on. They're kind of what happens to Kerri, right? She's going off to help in Ukraine, and she's going to be relying on some people on the ground to tell her what's the situation there and where you can go and where you can't go, right? So women are really good for this. And we're also really good at needs assessment, which is huge in disaster. Estimating what do women need, what do children need, what do communities need, what needs do we have, especially for those people who are most often overlooked. Obviously, women ourselves often overlooked, but so are children and others. So when it comes to doing a needs assessment in a community, like what are you going to need in your real recovery and what are you going to need in pre-disaster planning, women are really adept at putting these together. And we are skilled problem solvers and collaborative decision makers. We tend to not be unilateral dictators. We tend to be much more like, let me talk to everybody and figure out what's the best way forward here. So I think women bring particular strengths to disaster, and that's being recognized a lot in the United States. More and more women are getting into disaster work, and I think there's a reason for it. We belong there, and we're really good at some of the things that are needed most in disaster. So where are we at risk, right? So disasters don't discriminate, but people do. And, we can be in systems, particularly in certain parts of the world, where women are repressed, oppressed, non-included. I've spent many days now at the Conference on Status of Women, listening to women from Iran talk about what is going on in their situation, women from Afghanistan, and it's hard to see, like, wow, how would they get to play a strong role in disaster, given that there's just so much repression of them already, right? Disasters, especially in that every man for themselves phase, can make things even worse for women. So obviously war and conflict is a place where women can be in so much danger. Becoming a refugee, right? We know terrible things happen to refugees around the world, and women in particular are at risk being subverted into human trafficking systems as refugees, right? Obviously, the risk of sexual assault is very high. There tends to be, as Kerri talked about, higher loss of life, livelihood, and a longer time to recover for women, right? So economically, they can be super disadvantaged, but also in much more danger. And of course, being excluded, period, from any kind of disaster planning and leadership roles. This is where women face a lot of risk in disaster situations. But there's also opportunities in those situations. One of the things that we saw in the pandemic, and there's so many lessons that can be learned from the pandemic, but one that we saw is that when traditional models are upended, that's also an opportunity, right? So if the pandemic might have upended, like going to an office job, for example, and giving you the chance to work from home and really kind of demonstrating that a new model was possible in the world, there's kind of opportunity in disaster too, that, you know, maybe in a disaster, it's a time to be able to stand up to a government that's not been so good and go, hey, things need to change right now. We all are in this together, right? So there's opportunities in disasters because they're a strange place in time where you've left the normal and the new normal's not here yet. So in this in-between liminal space, there's opportunities to create different structures. So there's ways to use technology also to do this, right? So in the pre-disaster phase, you can research disaster prep and planning, right? There's well-known ways to do this. The United Nations has a really good disaster risk reduction program that people can apply for and get training on how to, do disaster prep and planning. And if there's not a plan, make one, right? So there's nothing wrong with a woman calling a town hall and saying, look, we might be at risk of, an earthquake, or we might be at risk of a fire, and we need to have a plan for this, right? And what are we going to do in that plan? Well, you're going to know what's in your community because you're going to inventory it, right? And so you're going to figure out what are the evacuation routes, where are the sites for shelter, are these schools, churches, are there structures in the community that could serve as a shelter? Where are mobile equipment locations, right? So where is power going to be? Where's food going to be? So that's a good thing to do as part of disaster prep, is to figure out where those places are that people can go and how we're going to resource them when we get there. And you saw how Kerri does it, right? That she brings in, this is after a disaster struck, obviously, but she's bringing in solar powered lights. She's bringing in cook stoves. She's bringing in tents, things like that. But, before Kerri gets on the scene, are there schools, are there churches, are there buildings in your community that would be more likely to have power? One of the things we're looking at in California is taking our schools in particular and some of our essential services, like where water districts are, and putting solar power panels on the roof so that in a disaster, when we lose power, which is very often in California, that we have a backup source of power and on top of a site that will be serving as a shelter, right? So you want to start thinking like this. And who are the agencies that would serve your area, right? And do you have contact with them? And so you want to set up those communication networks, right? So I talk to CAL FIRE a lot, and I talk to our sheriffs a lot, and a lot of the people that are involved in first responder networks in my community. But I've also made contact with the U.S. Coast Guard when my parents went missing in Puerto Rico. And, so you want to and I was very lucky. I was able to talk to the Policia in Puerto Rico as well, to warn them that there was a tidal wave that was likely to happen as a result of an earthquake. And they took me seriously. And the fire departments there. So, I mean, you want to have communications networks, and you want to talk to the people that are going to be serving your area and make sure you have a relationship with them. And if you don't, go ahead and set one up now, right? And meet with elected officials in your community. So I'm big on doing this, and part of the work that I do in politics, right? That I don't necessarily want to go bang on the door of an elected. I want the elected official to come to the community. I want them to get to know us. I want that person to see us, see what we're dealing with and struggling with. And I want them to know us by name, because I want them to take our phone calls when we have problems, right? So we want to also at this time push for the inclusion of women's needs and community needs. Kerri mentioned it in disaster. Girls often get bumped out of school, right? So how would we stop that? How would we ensure that there's a path to learning for kids? And you also want to hold your elected officials accountable. And again, I live in a democracy, you know, where I can do some of that work, and many of us do, but in some places that is not possible. We have to find other ways. Post-disaster, you want to look at keeping everybody safe first. Everybody needs to be safe. That is the just number one goal in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. Is we just need to get everybody as safe as we can. But, you know, a second priority is you need to find any and all allies. And allies can be the guy that owns a store at the corner that's willing to give food to people. Allies can be, you know, the person that's got a working mobile phone that's willing to let you use it. You know, whatever allies you can find, you're going to want them in the immediate aftermath. And you want to leverage technology tools that can be used in all phases of disaster. So there's a lot of this in play already in California because we are going through just an increased number of natural disasters. I know that in 2016, I helped a California legislator get elected, and she told me that the average number of disasters planned for in the state of California back in 2016 was 2. They planned for 2 a year. And that in her first year in the legislature, we went through like 12. That we are in some kind of different universe now where we expect much more climate related disasters in our particular state. And our response to that is amping up considerably. During the pandemic, I have to tell you, thank God that everybody decided to put their press conferences on YouTube. So every day I would watch the World Health Organization's press conference, and I watched them grapple with COVID-19 right up to the moment that they did decide that it was a pandemic. And then I watched governments around the world give press conferences on what they were going to do as we were going through it. Some countries went through the pandemic earlier than others, right? So obviously China went through it first, and then it kind of went heavy into Europe. And so I was watching the governments of Spain and Italy and France and Germany as they were dealing with the pandemic, and the US was about a month behind it hitting here. So I knew already what other countries were doing. And then I was able to kind of really help and guide the community as to what we would be looking at, right? What could we expect when the pandemic started hitting the United States? And also Facebook Live is really good for press conferences. I would get daily pings from Facebook on the governor of California giving a press conference, or the governor of New York, and I would watch theirs as well. And then I didn't even need media at that time. I was able to keep track of what government heads were saying and relate that to the community. It was really kind of reassuring everybody that, okay, there's going to be a response, you know, and okay, this is what we got to do. And okay, we need to mask up, and we need to protect ourselves, and we need to, you know, this is what it's going to take. And okay, the kids are going to be out of school. And it kind of helped everybody get in the boat together and say, we're just going to navigate this together, and the work that I was doing. During a disaster, obviously, you have journalism capabilities, right? Because we all have phones in our hands these days. You know, everybody's a journalist now, pretty much, right? So you can take pictures, you can, you know, document the recovery, you can document the impact, and you can share that with the world and leverage social media and news media. These days, we find out faster what is happening in Iran, Afghanistan, and Ukraine through social media than we ever do through news media anymore, right? That the social media networks have really disrupted the news media kind of cycles, and you can find out a lot more real-time information on the ground in various locations than you will ever get from news media. And what's interesting is social media also, it can be used to spread that information and disinformation. That's the negative of this, but it can be used to do that, and also to solicit for help. I've seen so much where there's been an impact, it's been terrible. And then immediately it moves to, okay, here are the orgs on the ground working to help these people. Can you fund them? In Ukraine, I met a woman through Twitter, just watching the Ukraine situation, and she was feeding the people in the community, right? She was figuring out how to do that. And we'd figured out a financial way of people in the US to be able to get money to her so that she could do that. And she would document, you know, how she was meeting up with people and figuring out who needed food, mostly seniors, honestly, and that she was going out and risking her life to get that food for her seniors. And there was quite a bit of support for her internationally. And then, you know, telling the story, right? So in politics, we always say be in control of your narrative. And I agree. So, you know, as a woman on the ground in disaster, always be in control of the narrative, right? And tell the story of people's resilience and how people are pulling together. And women are really good at keeping everyone together and communicating how and where we're moving forward, and what's the key information that you need to know, and what's coming, and getting people mobilized to that. So I'm going to show you some of the tools that I use actually in some of the work that I do. And you probably know right now we are in a atmospheric storm in California. We already have a disaster declaration happening. So some of the tools that I use, and these are freely available. My mom turned me on to this one during Hurricane Maria, and it's windy. And right now I'm watching it for rain that's going to fall because we're facing 2 atmospheric storms, one after another. And we already have a lot of people trapped in homes in the snow right now. You probably know that. And people are trying to get them out. Some people have passed away because we've just had way too much snow and too much rain. So I'm watching that, but it will also it'll clock wind speed for you as well. And that's really important actually is to,
it's not.
okay, we got somebody. Can everybody mute themselves, please? Thank you. So you can also clock wind speed, and I was watching the wind speed go to 175 miles an hour where my parents were in Salinas, Puerto Rico. It was just really traumatic experience to watch that, but at least I knew where they were, and we were able to direct the Coast Guard as to how to find them. Obviously, being in tune with what goes on in your weather is really important. So I watch the National Weather Service and they will do detailed forecasts down to your area and warn you about things that are coming, like we're in a heavy wind situation at the moment as well. I've also used some of the air quality monitors that we have. These are really inexpensive. They're called Purple Air. I think they cost like $6 a monitor. You can buy them, hook them up. And if you live in an area that's subject to poor air quality, such as we are with fires, they will let you know how your air quality is doing. And it costs nothing to connect them to the internet. And then you can monitor kind of what your situation is with air quality. We also, because we get subject to so much flooding and problems from flooding, we've constructed maps that show you what neighborhoods are likely to be at risk. So remember what I said about disaster planning, right? So because of previous debris flows that we've had, and because the mountains are still loaded for bear with boulders, and every time a rainstorm comes, it can send them down the hill on you, we have maps that will show you by parcel who needs to go. So like when the rain is coming, all the people in these neighborhoods all have to go, right? Because this is the area that's likely to flood. This is the area that's likely to get inundated with mud and where people perished before. And so we're very careful to warn people in those neighborhoods to go. We also keep cameras in debris basins that we've constructed up in the mountains. They're giant earth dams, if you will, and their job is to collect boulders and things rolling down the mountains before they hit the communities and wipe them out. And so we have cameras that will show you what's going on in those debris basins. Like you see one here is getting close to filling up, right? So those kinds of things help us. And then I would say too, there are tools through Twitter, right? Like it's always good to connect up through Twitter. Again, through Twitter is how I get sometimes to see real time what is happening in other countries that are experiencing conflict or oppression. But it's also a place to watch for a lot of the earthquakes. And it's also a place to watch for what are the preparations that are going on with disaster. So obviously I'm looking at atmospheric river because that's what's hitting us in California today as we speak. And so there's an awful lot of Twitter chatter that's going on about that. Facebook also can be pretty good too. During the debris flow, we had a network called the Thomas Fire Network. And this is where we posted up a lot of information about, resources, what was going on in the community, things to be alert for, people that needed help, who had checked on a neighbor, et cetera. And so these kind of Facebook groups, and I believe you can close them. So the people that are dealing with more oppressive government situations where online tools can be used for harm for the participants that are in them, you can close this network so that only the trusted people in the network can see what is being posted in that network. And I would totally advise that if you're in a situation where open information sharing actually could be somewhat dangerous to you. So those are some of the tools that I use in our particular part of the world where we have a lot of disaster that's caused by rain, and fire and natural causes. I don't have experience working in conflict, but I've been listening a lot this week to women who are working in conflict situations. It's got a level of danger added to it that I'm not experiencing. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain them. And I want to thank you so much for coming, and hope you feel, on hearing this, that women do have an extremely vital role to play in all phases of disaster, and that we should be playing it, and we should be leaders in whatever happens with disaster. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to raise your hand, ask them in chat, or turn your mic off and ask it. Any which way you'd like to go, I'm fine with it. And I'm curious if there are women on this call that also have disaster recovery experience.
Hello. Hi, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Hi, thank you so much. Honestly, this has been really interesting just to watch. And I'm calling in from the UK down in the South Coast. But so I've seen a lot about the NorCal resilience programs and lots of disaster preparedness stuff that happens in California. And obviously during the pandemic, we were trying to help set up something similar here in the UK. In the UK, obviously we don't have quite the weather issues that a lot of other places do, but we do at times have like storms and things and floodings. And it's just trying to understand, obviously, to get past the councils and the local authorities, to get them to understand the need for us to start thinking about building sort of more resilient infrastructure. So I just wondered, do you, I know you mentioned some of the stuff that we can do. I just wonder if you have any like top 3 tips if we're starting from scratch.
Oh, absolutely. So a couple things. First, Dawn, I'm a dual national. I'm also a British citizen, and I was actually just over there. I had to bury my sister in January. And you guys do have your own sets of disasters. I mean, you went through last year, right? Unprecedented heat wave, right? 103 degrees in London. It was just melted runways and stuff, right? So so you definitely have your own sets of disasters, right? So
yeah.
I would say a couple of things. One is, I'm gaining my strength coming from a place of being a writer, and I write for a couple of local newspapers here, but also from being a community organizer. So if you are having a non-responsive town council, well, I'm the kind of a girl that would pick up the torches and pitchforks and a crowd, and I would, and I would go and demand, like, hey, I don't think you're thinking this through. I don't think you're doing your duty here. You guys talk a big line politically about climate change when you want to ban a gas stove or ban a plastic bag, but what are you doing to actually prepare for it? Because anybody that knows anything about climate change knows that if you're going to live in a climate change world, which England clearly is, then, you have to actually prepare for that, right? So the painful lesson from California to you is we didn't prepare. We got hit really hard, and now we're having to really get on top of our game and catch up, right? And get very, very prepared. And California is really willing to live out on the edge, and I know you know that, but you sort of have to when you get these kind of gigafires, right? So you don't need to wait for the gigafire to hit. You already had the terrible heat wave. I mean, people like collapsed in the streets there, right? So now's a good time to get the community together, hold a big town hall, make it very public, invite everybody and their brother, and invite your town council to come and go, hey, look, we have concerns and don't feel like you're addressing them. We'd like to be part of a group that puts these kind of things together, right? I mean, lead it yourself, don't wait for them, lead it yourself and then bring them along. It also, I don't know if you know, but as much as I feel like local news media is kind of a dying thing, do you know what is the most read section of any newspaper? Do you know what it is?
No.
Letters to the editor. I kid you not. And the reason is because people want to know what other people are thinking. It's kind of why we all like social media so much, right? We all want to know what everybody else is thinking. Sometimes we really don't want to know what they're thinking and a lot of people, we don't want to know what they're thinking, but it's a way for you to tap into the collective consciousness. And anybody can harness the collective consciousness will scare a politician, right? Because, they're seeing votes threatened, right? So use your strength, right? Like use the strength of being able to pull people together. And like I said, if you went out and post up flyers around your neighborhood and said, there's going to be a town hall at the church next Thursday, and we're going to talk about risks to this community and the lack of planning, right? And call a couple of local newspapers, right? Because they have nothing to write about except the cat and the bake sale, right? So, I mean, call them because they want something to write about, right? Put it out on social media, get a crowd there, invite a couple of politicians and make a big deal out of it. You will see that you're going to get a different response. And don't be afraid to sit down with firehouses and sit down with local police and go, so what is the plan? You know, like if this
Mm.
happens, what is the plan, right? When you need to do mass evacuations, who gets to issue the call for evacuations? Who gets to decide where we're going to go? Who gets to decide when that call gets made, right? Because we got caught flat-footed by this too, that we didn't call for evacuations in time and people died, right? So that forced the question of whose call is that, you know, and then who carries it out, and who's responsible for getting people out. So don't be afraid to drive it. I like to say you have as much power as you think you have, right? So don't be afraid to drive that. And don't be afraid to gin up, you know, some controversy around it, because it will kind of force politicians never want to face a room full of angry people, and they particularly don't want to face a room full of angry women, right? So if you're going to do that, then also have some insights to give them, like, we would like to see a plan, we would like to be part of that plan, and we would like to be at the decision-making table for that plan, right? Lead them, you know, lead them, and then stay with it.
Okay, thank you so much. It's honestly really interesting because we keep saying that, you know, we do stuff and then we have to get those bodies to play catch up, but we don't really make a lot of noise. But we're on the cusp of doing that. So thank you for saying that, because I think, yeah, we're just going to do it now.
I think you should. Does everybody know the kind of the history of International Women's Day and how that all came around? Do you ladies know?
No.
Oh man, do some homework on it, right? Basically, the short story is a bunch of women got pissed off. A bunch of women got pissed off and things changed. You know, I could be missing some of it, but my understanding, it was rooted in some of the socialism kind of causes that were arising at the turn of the last century, and the agitation for women's suffrage, right? And so I think it started in Russia. Some women got really ticked off in World War I, and they were mad about bread lines, and they were mad about starvation, and they were mad about a lot of things. And they took to the streets and started marching, and that cleared the way for the Bolshevik Revolution. So when women get mad, big things can change, right? The second big women's march happened, I think, in the 30s, and that one cleared the way for the Spanish Civil War. So there's a big, I think the UN probably in despair said, just give them their own day. Don't let them make a lot of noise and trouble anymore, because, you know, very big things happen. When women get on their feet and get mad, the world does change. Maybe not in all the ways we want it to, but it does change. So I want to share that with you, that, you know, women mobilized are extremely powerful. There's a restaurant here in New York City, Delmonico's, and they have on their menu as a point of pride that they were the first restaurant in New York in the 1920s that allowed women to congregate publicly, because apparently we're very dangerous when we get together in groups. So don't be afraid to be dangerous. Don't be afraid to, you know, make some noise, and don't be afraid to turn around and ask some people, you know, like, what are you doing? You know, I think I'm going to hold you accountable, right? That's women have that unique power. And so there's a question here on people with disabilities. So again, really, really thank you for bringing this up. Mercy, thank you for bringing this up, right? Because again, this is where I think women have particular strength. Yes, people with disabilities have particular needs, and not only do they, but the seniors, right? So again, we've learned this in evacuations, when we've had to do emergency evacuations. What's going to be the plan for people who are wheelchair bound, people who need breathing apparatus when the power goes out, right? You know, how are we going to get their oxygen machines to work? Those kinds of things need to be planned out in advance, and it should be part of disaster prep and planning. And it should also be known, like, where are we going to take people to? We had a senior facility, when the debris flow hit, they were completely isolated. The mud went around them in both directions, so there was no way out for them. And so we actually had to get a helicopter in to pick them up and take them out by helicopter. There was no road was passable for them. So you have to think, you know, there's a very good question on dealing with people with disabilities, or dealing with people who are movement challenged, right? Like, what is going to be that prep plan? And again, I think women are uniquely positioned to make that case, think it through, and make sure that there is a plan for folks. Okay, and so women who've added a layer of oppression. Yes. Okay, so man, so, you know, you're asking me a really good question, the Humanitarian Network, a really good question. Yes, pressure from outside. Okay, so this question is around women in oppressed countries, right? So, for example, what would happen if there's an earthquake in Iran right now, right? And a bunch of women had to run to shelter and didn't have time to find hijabs, right? Would the morality police punish them? This is the at-risk, this is where women are so at risk in the conflict kind of situations or in really oppressive regimes. If there was any upside to that, one of the things that can happen, like I say, in disaster, and we all have gotten to see this firsthand in the pandemic, is it can flip norms upside down. And while those norms are flipped, it's a good opportunity to push for a different direction, right? So if there was a disaster in Afghanistan, if there was a disaster in Iran, it would be the perfect opportunity for women to step out in the forefront and go, hey, look, you guys are all really busy putting out fires or whatever. We're going to take leadership. We're going to take charge. And then it becomes harder to push that back. And I'm telling you this as a US woman who's watching our rights get eviscerated by the minute. And we need to stand on our feet against that. But that's the opportunity, I think, if there's in a disaster, is that the norm goes out the window. And because it's this crazy limbo state, right? Where you're not sure how things are going to work because everything's in a bit of chaos. It's an opportunity for women to be able to step forward. But it's all, conflict is a disaster of its own. And that is a place that is extremely dangerous to women. And I do think that the UN has a role to play in this. I think the NGOs have a role to play in this too, in terms of trying to change those conditions on the ground for women. Yes, Maria, you're right. Norway had a part in that, in the Women's March too. All right, Dr. Donald, thank you. Oh, good. You have something coming up on digital democracy for disasters on the 16th.
Yes, yes, we do. And it's going to be in person, but we're trying to make sure that we've got a Facebook Live and a YouTube, and we're going to have to supplement it because it's going to be shocking time for our people in our region of the world. So, yes, so we were a little bit isolated here. And yes, by my Aussie accent, you can tell. No, look, what you've said is just so practical and so sensible and can really relate to the sorts of things we're doing. But we have to be a little bit more structured because we have a disaster once a month we got to attend to.
Yeah, we do too. We do too. That's why we've had to get on our game about this, right? We're like, so this isn't just a one-off, right? This is going to be our new normal, right? Is the gigafires, and what are we going to do? You guys went through the gigafires literally a few months before we did, right?
In 2019, yeah. But we have lost 2 million people in a 2-hour storm a few years ago, and that shocked us so much that we just had to get much, much better. So yeah, but we're continually learning. So long as we can share with those most vulnerable people, we'll be fine.
I think
we can hold our head up high at least. Yeah,
that's a key thing. And I have to tell you, I was listening to a woman from Ukraine this morning. I'm still thinking about the women that are in the much more dangerous situations, right? And she was saying that they had developed an app that could communicate directly with police, so that when they were in a dangerous situation and they didn't want the danger around them to know that they were reaching out to the police, they could communicate directly using this app. And I have to tell you, when I did some work in gang intervention in California, it was a similar kind of thing, that the neighbors were very oppressed by the local gangsters that were kind of terrorizing them. It was a really tough, and it was all women, by the way, that were being oppressed naturally. Yeah. That was who was afraid to be moving around. And we all learned how to do text chains right on our phone, right? Where we would, make a text group on the phone. And for all you knew, I was looking at my Twitter news story, not texting all the neighbors like, hey, the guy on the corner's got a gun, like everybody stay indoors, right? So like learning how to communicate like that, amongst the need to know crowd, if you will, right? And making sure that people stay safe. I think that's a big part of this. But yes, like you in Australia, we seem to be having about disaster a month, and we're having to learn how to really, and as you can see, what's the latest one that hit us is snow. And again, flat-footed, right? Just completely flat-footed response. People have now died in their homes because they couldn't get out because they're under 10 feet of snow. And all the snow plows in the world did not seem, like we just can't get up a hill, right? So we're in a similar kind of boat where it's just like, wow, when you get hit on all fronts, you have to get much better at this.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are some techniques. That's why we need to learn from everywhere else in the world, because even though it might be used for a totally different, like snowplows, we can take the lessons learned and apply to what we've already got and make, leapfrog technology. So that's what we're looking to do when we're engaging our audience, because everybody comes with different experience, and what a waste if we don't put that into good use while we're together. So I'm writing up a report, or we are writing up a report out of the suggestions, the recommendations, because we'll be doing digital democracy online during our meeting. So it was in.
That's brilliant, actually. Believe it or not, I'm still sitting here doing I'm sitting in New York City, right, at this conference, but I'm still having to message my usual groups in California about, okay, don't leave the house right now. There's flooding, et cetera. I'm like, so, you could do this from anywhere, I guess, is that you don't have to necessarily be on the ground, when it comes to digital organizing, right, and keeping people together, and you could do that from anywhere. And that also was a good lesson from the pandemic, and I think women are really good for this. I think we need to do more of it. Ladies, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time and attention, and I hope that I've just fired up a bunch of women out there that will know what the heck to do when the next disaster hits.
Yes, and to deal with the emotional stuff, that behavioural stuff you're talking about, that helps us so much more, because it just takes it out of the ticker box approach, that our heroes tend to implement. So thank you.
I agree with you. There's a concept that we've coined out here that I hope gets mainstream, and it's second responders. So first responders are your police, fire guys, your army guys, your military evacuation guys, all that. That's your first responders. But there's another term, which is second responders. And these are the people who dig the community out of the mud, right? Long after all the heroes went home. These are the people that figure out how we're going to clothe everybody that lost everything, that are going to figure out how we're going to, like, who's the guy that's cooking for everybody, right? He goes to disasters and he cooks for everybody, right? So he's not a first responder. He's not.
That sounds like what we do, yes.
Yeah, you need the second responders are huge, right? Because it's like, how are we going to get the kids back into school, right? Firefighters aren't going to worry about that. That's going to be our job.
That's our 3 week, where there's 3 days, 3 weeks, and 3 weeks, you've got to get the men to work, and you've got to get the kids to school. Otherwise it'll be chaos. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is. And thank you all very much for coming, and feel free to, I'm actually I think I put my contact info in, but I'll put it in, and you're welcome to contact me at any time. And anybody who wants any help, organizing your community, let me know, because I also do that. Dawn, I just got busy lobbying a couple of members of parliament over something. So I'm happy to, I know no bounds for sure. It's just so you know, right? I'm happy to lobby anybody's government and get something done. But you're welcome to contact me if you have any questions or need any assistance at all, or coaching, or if you want to fire up a community to get involved to do this, happy to do a session with you. And thank you all very much. And I'm so honored to be with such a great group of women during the conference on the status of women. I feel like we should be doing this all the time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.